So the talk today is by the wonderful Timo Hannay, who is the founder of School Dash, and you've probably seen his work already. Even if you don't know it, he's done a fantastic job of analyzing school data and having that work presented in numerous places, which he's going to talk about, so I'm not going to preempt that. He is an advisor various groups, including something called the Ada Lovelace Day, which I particularly appreciate because my daughter's called Ada. And he works with edtech companies, with charities, and with governments, offering advice on data in education. So an absolutely fantastic person to come and speak to us today in this group. Now, during his talk today, his talk's going to be about 60 minutes. There is going to be a Q&A at the end. I've spoken to Timo, and he would prefer it if people ask questions during the talk. So don't feel you need to sit on those questions until the end. I will try and keep an eye on the chat window. So if you want to drop a question in there, or even if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, as long as it don't get too rowdy, then we'll let those things go ahead. And Timo will try and answer your questions as you go. Now, the other thing he said is he's very happy to share his slides, and so we'll do that afterwards. This meeting's being recorded, so you'll be able to access a recording afterwards, and I will try and remember to make a copy of the chat window. So lots of links are going to be shared, and I'll try and make sure that you've got access to them too. So hopefully you can just focus on the talk and you don't need to make too many notes. And I'm sure it's going to be a really, really interesting one. Okay, I'll stop sharing now. Oh, actually, I'll tell you what, before I do that, I'm going to quickly mention this is a new group. If you have, if you'd like to speak, or you can think of anybody else you'd like to hear from, or companies you'd like to hear from, or research groups, anything like this, please do let me know. And there is another meetup already booked, and that's going to be from Anya. She's going to talk about her work at the Learning Agency Lab, which is very exciting. So please do put that one in the diary as well, and I'll reach out to you about that near the time. And that's it all from me. Over to Timo.
Thanks so much, Simon. Thanks, everyone. I trust you can hear me. Simon can perhaps give me a thumbs up or something if you can hear me okay. Yanis is giving me a thumbs up. Thanks, Yanis. 2 thumbs up, no less. Brilliant. Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for showing up. I'm actually going to try and spend most of the talk showing you some sort of live, in some cases, interactive charts and visualizations to explain some of the work we've been doing, but I'm going to start off with some slides and I'm going to end with the slides. And as Simon said, we'll share the slide deck afterwards, and the slide deck does include screenshots of various things that I'm going to show you and URLs to those pages where they're publicly available. So I'm also, Simon sort of alluded to this, but I'm also going to try and drop some URLs into the chat as I go along. We'll have to see how this goes. I'm sort of multitasking here, but I'm going to try and drop some URLs into the chat as we go along, so that if any of you want to fire up a browser and have a look at the pages I'm talking about, or play around with the figures yourself, or indeed go off and do your own thing because it's more interesting than what I'm talking about, then that's fine. So we'll try and make that work as well. With that, I'm going to just try and share my slides first of all. Excuse my croaky voice. Hopefully it will last the session. And also just to reinforce what Simon was saying, if you have questions and comments, please do post them in the chat, or perhaps you can put up your hand and Simon will be able to see that. I'm actually just trying to see whether I can see the chat while I've got my slides going. I don't think I can. I sometimes have this issue with, so I'm not sure I can see the chat while I'm showing you the slides, while I'm showing my screen. So maybe Simon or others can help me, and you can chime in if there are any questions, but please do ask as you go along.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and if Yanis, if you can do that as well, then we're doubly covered. Perfect.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about using unconventional data sets. I'm going to just start off with like a minute or two, just telling you a little bit about what we do as School Dash. So I created School Dash about 6 years ago now, having had a career in sort of technology around research and academic publishing. But I was very interested in, and I'd created a software and data business in the sort of research sphere that was a spin-off business from Nature Publishing Group, where I used to work, a big scientific publisher. And I was interested in doing something in data and software in another domain that I care about, but not in research. So education caught my attention for a variety of reasons. And one is I think that the available data is really underexploited. And I think that remains true today, 6 years down the road, just as it was, when I started School Dash. Hopefully a little bit less underexploited as a result of our activities, but we're just really, we're just scratching the surface, I think. So what I'm going to talk about today is, as I say, using unconventional data sets, something we've been doing since before the pandemic, but has become particularly salient, I think, during the pandemic. And hopefully by the time I've explained to you what we've been up to, you'll at least to some degree agree with me. I should say there was a much earlier version of this presentation I gave to government in about June under the auspices of the Cabinet Office. So I don't know if any of you joined that meeting or are a part of government. If so, you'll recognise some of this, but there will be plenty of new material as well. So hopefully it won't be just repeating things. Let me just try and forward my slides. Yeah, so our mission as School Dash is to understand education through the use of data. So we try and be imaginative in the way that we use data to answer interesting, relevant, salient questions, and we try hard to present it in a visually compelling, comprehensible way. When I've showed you a few examples during this talk, you can judge for yourselves how much we achieve that. I think sometimes these work better than other times, but hopefully in general they work okay. And we very much like to use sort of interactive visualizations in order to give people the liberty of being able to explore the data a little bit themselves. And it's to that end I'll be showing you some interactive figures that we've created and inviting you to play with them if you want by posting the URLs. Let me just going to see whether I can. Oh no, I can see the chat now. Okay, I've worked that out because that will make it a lot easier for me to post the URL so you can see them. We work with a really wide range of organizations. Simon alluded to these already, but they include, big educational suppliers like publishing companies, academic societies like Institute of Physics, Royal Academy of Engineers, charities like Gatsby and Wolfson, media companies like the BBC or The Economist, edtech companies. You can see a bunch of them here on this slide. So we work with a wide range of organizations to help them better understand education, and in some cases to use their data to help them understand their own market much more effectively. And much of what I'm going to be talking about today is making use of data that our collaborators have gathered, and we're just trying to help them make the most of it. So if we're going to talk about unconventional data, it's perhaps worth just defining what we mean by conventional data. So what I mean by conventional data is basically the official data, mostly put out by government agencies or regulators. So in this case, particularly the Department for Education, Ofsted, the ONS, for more general kind of economic and socioeconomic and demographic data, and other government departments like MHCLG. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise, so if people aren't muted, perhaps you can just check if you're muted. Also things like the Department for Transport and other government departments. So that's really what I mean by conventional data, these statutory official data sets that are often collected on something like an annual basis, or in the case of the census, much less frequently, and put out by government departments or regulators. And so mostly what I'm going to be talking about is making use of other types of data sets that are out there, and there's lots of them. But I also just wanted to say a quick word that we make lots of use of conventional data sets, and we make lots of use of them in conventional ways. But one of the things that we try to do also is make use of conventional data sets in unconventional ways. So before I dive into using unconventional data sets, I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that we do with the more traditional data sources as well, because I think it's really possible to be creative. I think, again, I'm not saying that we're the state of the art here, but I think it's possible to make creative use of official data sets and statutory data sets. I don't want to denigrate them. And in fact, the examples I'll show you later the sort of unconventional data sets often involves combining those with the official data sets in order to be able to tell us a bit more about what's going on in the system. For example, we can use EdTech usage data and tie that into information of the school, the type of schools involved, the locations of the schools involved that come from the Department for Education. And that tells us a lot more than if we just had one of those data sets on its own. But we also try and make sort of unconventional, at least imaginative uses of conventional data sets. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, a few examples of those, just to give you a flavor, and then we'll dive in much more detail into what I would categorize as unconventional data sets. So we've done a bunch of separate analyses over the years with BBC News, particularly with a correspondent called Sean Coghlan, who until recently was Education and Families correspondent for BBC News. And we've done quite a lot of geographical analyses with him. So these are all on our blog. In fact, maybe I can even, if you want to go and have a look at them later, I will post the links in the chat now. These are the blogs I'm talking about. I'm not going to dwell on these, but just to give you a flavor, we for one of them, this one at the top left, we linked up education data, particularly Ofsted rating type data, with transport or travel time information for the Department for Transport, and we're able to do analysis of geographical isolation in schools. And the short version of the summary is that geographical isolation doesn't have a big effect generally, but it has a big effect on secondary schools when it's combined with poverty. So if you're in a poor area that's geographically isolated, it's extremely likely that the school is a underperforming one, very high probability. It doesn't make so much difference in more affluent areas. It doesn't really make much difference to primary schools as far as we can tell. So we were sort of combining, official data sets, but in ways that, as far as we were aware, hadn't been done before. This graph here in the center of this slide is an analysis we did on coastal communities. It's something of sort of perennial interest among sort of Britain watchers, particularly in the media, the subject of coastal deprivation in particular. And in essence, what we were showing there is that coastal communities are incredibly varied, and you can identify lots of places around the coast that show high levels of deprivation on multiple dimensions, but it's not everywhere around the coast, and it's not particularly meaningful to talk about coastal communities in general because they're incredibly varied. And then perhaps most strangely of all, and this was really inspired by some stuff that Sean came to us with, we also made use of a historic data set. In this case, this was to do with World War II bombing locations. There's a project that collected all of that information. We were able to geolocate it and show where the bombs had fallen. And there's actually a blog post that runs an animation that, in fact, some history teachers and things are using now to show what happened during World War II in terms of the bombing on Britain. And we did some sort of analysis looking at, kind of what had come of the places that were bombed, particularly those beyond London and the southeast. Not necessarily drawing any causal link, but these are just examples of things where we've taken data sets that have been around for a long time or are kind of very much conventional and made rather unconventional use of them. And finally on that, we also, we've done some other work we do work on tracking head teacher appointments, which is this graph here. That's part of our insight service. That comes from head teacher names that are published by the Department for Education, but we're able to follow those people through their names around the schools that they get appointed to. We've done some work. This strange looking map here is work that looks at which parts of the country should we really treat as similar. So typically we do these regional analysis. We talk about the Northeast, and we talk about London and the Southeast and the Midlands and so forth. So we treat places that are geographically close to one another as similar, but that's not always the case. And so we did a blog post. Again, I'll post a link here, post some links to what I'm talking about here in the chat. We did a blog post that looked at, well, if you're really going to talk about areas of the country that were sort of socioeconomically and demographically and educationally similar, which ones would you really group together? And that's what this strange looking map is here. We've also, in recent months, done some work with The Guardian on the schools guide, a much more kind of data-rich, multi-dimensional schools guide than the traditional school league tables that are typical in daily newspapers and Sunday newspapers. That's making use really of statutory data, but in hopefully a more imaginative way that makes it more meaningful and accessible and richer for parents and families and others who are making decisions about schools. So I'm going to stop at that because this is not the subject of today's talk, but I just wanted to make clear that there's lots of things you can do with the conventional data. I don't want to denigrate that, and we spend probably most of our time using that data actually. But let's talk about unconventional data. So I'm going to give 5 examples. I'm going to dive into 5 examples here, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the clock so we don't overrun. And just to give you kind of a sense of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to give an example from social media, an analysis that we've done there and that we do actually fairly regularly. Some work that we've been doing a lot of work on formative assessment tests using using data specifically from Hodder Education or their RS assessment division, looking at learning loss during the pandemic, but also that work goes back to well before the pandemic as well. We think there are lots of interesting signs in there. We've worked with about a dozen edtech companies, mostly through Nesta, to look at their usage data and what it can tell us about what's going on, particularly again during the pandemic. I'll show you some examples of what we've done there. We've used wellbeing surveys from EduKit. Other wellbeing surveys are available, but we've used their data to understand how kids have been getting on during lockdown and before lockdown actually. And we use school websites. We index data and information from school websites, particularly around school recruitment activity. And in fact, we've just put out a big new report on that with Gatsby and TeacherTapp. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of what we're talking about. What I'm going to do now is jump to my browser and try and show this to you live, which is always asking for trouble, but is much more fun, if less predictable. So I'm going to try and do a new share here, and hopefully you'll be able to see my browser. And we'll go to the first of these examples, which is social media, specifically Twitter. Hopefully you can see my browser window now. So
your browser window is showing, at least it is showing for me, if anyone is struggling to see anything.
So wave frantically, I'll put something in the chat if you can't see my browser window. So this is, and I'm going to, if I forget to put the links in the chat, if people want them, then remind me. But here's a link. So this is a blog post on our website. It came out on the 1st of January, so it is more than 10 months old now. We'll put another one out at the beginning of January next year. This is a review of basically what were people saying about schools and education on Twitter last year. No prizes for guessing the general theme of discussion, but hopefully you'll agree that there's some sort of interesting things that you can pull out of the data by quantifying and analyzing it. And I dare say we use the Twitter API to take a constant feed of like example tweets that mention certain terms around schools and education that are sort of also geolocated to the British Isles effectively. So it's only a subsample, it's a very small subsample of tweets, but you can do some interesting things with it. I have to say up front, I don't consider this particular analysis to be like really deep and meaningful. In a way, it's a bit of fun, but I think it's also somewhat informative, even if it only reinforces certain preconceptions that we might have about people's feelings about what's going on or what has been going on. So this is from the last calendar year, and I'm going to take you through a few figures here on this blog post just to show you what sorts of things we were doing. So this is a very simple plot that runs from January to December last year and just looks at the number of tweets. So we can't track the absolute number because this is just a sample and we don't know what proportion of all tweets it is, but it is in proportion to the total number of tweets matching that are sort of filtering criteria. And you can see there's a kind of weekly cycle, it goes up and down. And you can see there are these huge spikes as well that coincide with various events. So this one here in mid-March 2020 was the original lockdown and school closures. Suddenly lots and lots of people tweeting about schools and education because schools were being closed. There was also around about here, this was the free school meal debacle where the government found itself in a fight with Marcus Rashford. And I think this was the point at which they acquiesced. This peak here had to do with the exam debacle. There were lots of debacles. The exam debacle during the summer. And there was another peak right at the end of the year when it was made clear that schools would not be reopening immediately in the new year. So it very much tracked kind of events in the outside world in terms of just the sheer volume of tweets. We can, of course,
We've got a quick question here, Timo, from Anna H, which is, did you know who was doing the tweets? So is it parents or students or?
Yeah, we don't know. So, I mean, you can guess by looking at some of them, but they're effectively anonymous because they're just, I mean, we know the Twitter handle. We don't do any work to try and follow up on those people and see who they are. we're just analysing the contents of the tweets themselves. We do a little bit of work to filter out what you might term sort of very prolific tweeters. So these are probably bots and spammers. So we do some work to filter those out. But beyond that, you know, most of them are, it would appear that most of them are parents and students, with a proportion of teachers as well, but mostly parents and students is the sense I get, but we haven't analysed that in any detail.
Okay, and thank you.
Sure. And then the next question, are there any topics that trend? Cool. Hold your horses, that's what I'm coming to next. So thanks for teeing me up. So we can look at like what subjects are discussed. This is just a word cloud, you know, and you can look at it by month. So back in January, you know, the naive days of January, you know, people were talking about all sorts of stuff, but nothing to do with coronavirus. Come February, coronavirus was already featuring very large, and by March, because of the school closures, no prizes for guessing what was discussed there. But we can quantify that a bit more. And here's a chart that's a little bit similar to the one we were looking at earlier in terms of numbers of tweets, but this is now broken down by subject area. So for example, we can look at the tweets that had something to do with school closures or cancellations of various things. So that obviously peaked a lot in March, but there were subsequent peaks as well, as various announcements were made. Things around distance learning and homework actually is a sort of perennial topic anyway. I mean, homework and working at home and kids studying at home predates the pandemic as a topic, but has been somewhat raised during the pandemic, you know. And then you've got sort of things like coronavirus itself, actually a relatively small proportion of tweets. Exams, so that obviously peaked in the summer. So you get the idea. You can tease these things apart, and you can look at the terms within the tweets to get a sense of what people were talking about, and those wax and wane with the external events. What I think is, so someone's asking what's the most common topics pre-COVID. That's quite a big subject. We have earlier, all I can say is we have earlier blog posts. We've run this kind of Twitter analysis for the last 2 or 3 years. I can't even remember exactly when we started it. So you can go back to our older blog posts. So look on our blog, look at the older blog posts, and if you've still got questions, you can contact me. And my email address will be on the slide at the end. But it's at timo@school-.com, so it's not hard to remember. But anyway, have a look at the older blog posts, and then do get in touch if it still doesn't make sense. Now, what it would be nice though would be to be able to understand, what do people think about this, right? Not just what are they talking about, but like what, you know, are they happy about this? Are they sad about it? Are they angry? Blah blah blah. So we wanted to conduct some sentiment analysis. So, you know, I'm in a virtual meeting here full of data scientists, so you all know about sentiment analysis. And in essence, you know, as I see it, there are sort of basically 2 ways of doing it. You can either, at least with Twitter data, there's sort of 2 ways of doing it. You can either create some kind of machine learning system or a natural language processing system and try and sort of, you know, parse those sentences and work out what the sentiment is. Or you can look at the emojis and count the emojis and guess which one we did for this particular analysis. So this is a bit rough and ready, but I actually think it works pretty well. So what we did was we counted the emojis. So we classified emojis into sort of positive, neutral, and negative. And then we looked at what the ratio between the positive and negative ones were, effectively in all the tweets, first of all. So if you look at all the tweets, generally speaking, we're above 0. So what that means is the net emoji score, as we're terming it here, is sort of positive. There's more happy emojis than sad emojis. But you'll see there's a definite dive at various periods. So this was the original school closures. This, I think, was the free school meal. Maybe actually this, I actually can't quite remember. This was the free school meal dip, I think. I can't quite remember what the November one was, actually. But anyway, you can see it goes up and down depending on what people are talking about and what's going on. On average, it tends to be positive. So there are more smileys than sad face emojis, as it were, more positive emojis than negative emojis. But the other thing you notice about the overall trend is during the course of last year, it definitely came down. So aside from all of these day-to-day, week-to-week fluctuations, the general trend was downwards. And then finally, another thing you can do is you can then correlate this, right, this kind of positive or negative sentiment, the net emoji score, with this, which is what were people talking about. And you can say, okay, how does that correlate? So these are basically the correlation coefficients between the topics and the net emoji score. And there probably aren't any big surprises here. I'm not sure there's any big surprises in any of this analysis. It's just a bit of fun, really. But the 3 least popular things in terms of the sentiment were the coronavirus itself, the closures and cancellations, and government policy, because government always gets a kicking during these sorts of times. Interestingly, there was a lot of negative sentiment about key workers. Key workers weren't actually discussed a great deal. Key workers were in here somewhere. There was a lot of discussion about them at the beginning, and that was the negative sentiment. Was not so much to do with key workers themselves. It was more to do with lack of clarity in people's minds about who was classified as a key worker and what special dispensations they had. So there was a lot of discussion about that early in the pandemic, and that elicited quite a lot of negative emotions, or at least negative emojis. Interestingly, distance learning was net positive. So, go figure. So that doesn't seem to be something, at least on Twitter, that was animating people in a negative way, particularly. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to run out of time. I've still got 4 more to show you, and we're already half an hour in. But hopefully that gives you a flavor of the sorts of things you can do with social media data. This is not a particularly big and serious analysis. It's a little bit of fun, but we also hope that it's illustrative of the things that one can extract from this kind of data, and it gives you it mostly kind of I think confirms one's preconceptions about what people are talking about, how they feel about it, but nevertheless I think it's interesting to be able to quantify it and to be able to analyze it a little bit more rigorously. Not that I would claim that Twitter is necessarily completely representative of the world at large, but or in fact representative of anything in particular, but I think it does tell us some things, and if nothing else, it's a little bit of fun. So we'll be putting out a new one, I'm sure, in early January, assuming we have time to run the numbers again, and we'll see what people have talked about this year. Right, with that, I'm going to move on to number 2. Now something a little bit meatier, a little bit more policy relevant. This is to do with attainment, specifically primary attainment. So let me just throw a link into, I'm going to throw 2 links into the chat if people want to follow along. So one is just a very short blog post. The first link is a very short blog post on our site that really just points to the report, and the second is the actual report itself. And I'm going to take you through, unfortunately the report is static, so I'm not going to be able to do like the interactive stuff, but I will show you some of the charts that we put in it, because they are, I think this is contrary to the Twitter analysis, I think this is genuinely important, and it has garnered a lot of interest in policy circles inside and outside government. And the background is that we've been working for several years now, probably for about 5 years, so certainly most of School Dash's existence, with Hodder Education, big education publisher. One of their businesses is called RS Assessment, and they sell assessment tests into primary schools, actually into other schools, but their longest established business is selling assessment tests into primary schools. And about 4 years ago or so, we started working on what can that data set tell us about the country as a whole. And in this case, I'm talking about England as a whole. Because whilst unlike the SATs, which are the statutory government tests, the Hodder tests are not sat by every school. They're not used by every school. They're used by maybe something like 15 or 20% of schools, roughly speaking, depending on which tests we're talking about. But it's a big representative sample. And even more importantly, the kids at those schools are sitting those tests typically every single term, right, throughout their primary school years. Whereas the government data is, typically gathered at age 7, at age 11, and then there's no more data until they hit 16 or 18 with their GCSEs and A levels. It's a very rich data set on a very large sample. And before the pandemic, we were running lots of analyses. We put out 2 or 3 white papers looking at things like gender differences, things like summer-born kids, differences by parts of the country, differences by levels of disadvantage within school and in local neighborhoods, differences by Ofsted rating, all of these kinds of fairly typical analyses, but using the results that they, if you like, were gathering school by school and offering back to the individual schools to track their pupils, using those in an anonymous way to be able to say what's going on in the country as a whole. Then coronavirus comes along, and of course this becomes even more pertinent. So since the pandemic started, we've put out papers every term, actually looking, certainly every term that schools have been open, because these tests are sat mostly with pencil and paper in school. And we've been using comparisons of the current cohorts in school with previous cohorts to see what do we estimate the learning loss to be. And it's important to realize that even though each year we're talking about different cohorts of kids, the tests are actually exactly the same by and large. And the scores, so the mean values and the distributions of the scores are extremely stable from year to year. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of tests sat every year, many millions of tests in aggregate across thousands of schools. So these are these are very, very statistically robust effects, and we can look at current cohorts and how they compare with earlier cohorts, pre-pandemic cohorts. So this is the latest paper we put out, which was using results that up to and including the end of the summer term, that's just, that finished in sort of July. And this was the topic of subject of much debate and focus by policy people inside and outside government. I know because we were talking with lots of them about it, and they were asking for further details. So I'm just going to show you a little bit. So again, I've sent you the link to this report already. You can read it at your leisure. Sorry that these aren't fun interactive figures, but I'm just going to show you a few of the figures so you can get a sense of what sorts of analyses we did. So this is showing the year-on-year change in reading. So we're going to look separately at reading, GPS, which you might think of as writing, grammar, punctuation, spelling, GPS, and maths. So there's these three areas in which the kids are tested. And if you just focus on year one for the time being, this pulls together data from across multiple terms. So at the end of the autumn term, so that's basically a year ago, almost a year ago now, the kids had fallen back. These are standardized score marks. You don't need to worry too much about what they are, but basically 0 means they're on track. They're similar to previous cohorts. You can see these are almost all negative. So in almost all cases, the kids have fallen behind compared to previous cohorts, and they've fallen behind more in some subjects than in others. But at the end of the autumn term, when they'd been back at school basically for a term, so they'd been off school for about 6 months last year, then they came back in the autumn term, they've been back at the autumn term, back for the autumn term. They were a bit behind, certainly the year one kids were in reading. Then schools were closed again in the spring, or sorry, at the beginning of this calendar year, so in January, February, and the kids went back briefly and sat their tests again at the end of that spring term, sort of around March time, and they'd fallen a lot further behind. So that was just from a further 2 months off school, actually. And then, of course, they went back to school, and these are the results after they'd been back for the summer term, for in most cases, the whole of the summer term. Obviously, there's still ongoing disruption that varies by individual and by school. And so what you see was there was quite a bounce back. There was a big increase in the deficit, in the year-on-year deficit during the spring term, when there was further disruption during January and February this year. And it bounced back a little bit, at least for younger kids, bounced back a little bit in the summer term, but not fully by any means. You can see that older kids generally fared a bit better, so they haven't fallen back as far. But this is just in reading, so we get different patterns by other subjects. So reading actually was generally the best. So this is about the least effect that we saw. We can also look at things like the distribution. I'm going to skip a few slides. So you can look at the distribution of scores. So what we were just looking at there was the mean. Here we're looking at the distribution. It's got this step structure because the standardization process for the scores means that only certain scores are possible. So ignore that. But what I'm really just trying to show you here is we're comparing the summer results. This is particularly for year one, actually, where the effect was biggest, for pre-pandemic summer cohort in 2019 and the latest summer results. And you can see that for the latest results, the scores are shifted to the left, means that on average they're getting lower scores. But what you can see, actually, it's particularly concentrated in the kids who are scoring lower. So up towards the top end of the scoring range, there's actually not a great deal of difference. So the higher performing kids seem to be mostly maintaining their scores, it would seem, and the lower performing kids are slipping back, and that's what's causing the reduction in the mean score. So it's not always evenly distributed, and we need to keep an eye on the distributions, not just on the mean changes. What else was I going to show you here? I'm not going to dwell on this, but another thing we can do is to tease apart reading into different topics within reading. We see that phonics was particularly badly affected. We also see that what's known as LSP, language structure and presentation, was particularly badly affected. So we can tease those apart. We can even tease them apart down to the individual question level, although we tend not to do that. So it's not the fact that like all reading tasks or all reading skills are affected equally, and the same within writing and within maths as well. Let me quickly show you some of the other examples. So this is now in GPS, so grammar, punctuation, and spelling. If you remember what I was just showing you for reading, overall here the effects are worse. Once again, we get this similar pattern, which is that there was a big regression in the spring term when after schools have been closed for another couple of months, and some bounce back, but by no means all. in the summer. So kids really ended up still quite a long way behind by the end of the academic year. And the younger kids did worse still in GPS in the same way that they did for reading. So older kids tended to do better, but all year groups were behind. Year 6, you need to treat with a little pinch of salt because the sample sizes tend to be a bit lower for that, especially in the summer term, because by then they're sort of effectively finished school, or finished primary school, I should say. So don't overinterpret those. But overall, the pattern is the younger kids fared worse than older kids at primary school. We can also see, this is an analysis of pupil premium versus non-pupil premium kids. So we're looking at the pupil premium gap in a pre-pandemic year. So this is the last summer term pre-pandemic, 2019, are the blue columns. We can see that pupil premium kids really across all the different year groups were about 6 points. It doesn't matter exactly what that is, but 6 points behind the non-pupil premium kids on average. And that gap increased during the pandemic. So for all year groups, some more than others, but for all year groups, it did increase. So this is showing the disadvantage gap opening up during the course of the pandemic and helping to quantify it. Not surprising, but depressing and very important from a policy point of view. Let me think. We can also, just as we did for reading, we can split apart GPS into its different components, and we see things like, generally speaking, different subjects suffer differently, or different topics within the subject suffer differently. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. You can see once again the younger kids suffer more, but certain topics, so punctuation and spelling, for example, in these year groups seem to have done particularly badly. And I will leave to people who are more expert than me on the curriculum as to why that might be. But we're able to tease those apart, and that helps with more targeted interventions, if you like, to try and help kids catch up. I'll just finally show you maths quickly. Where have we got maths? I should say there are all sorts of regional differences and things like that we looked at, but I won't dwell on those now. Here's what we saw for maths. In this case, we're including reception year as well. We've got summer results for reception in maths. Once again, we do see a broadly similar picture, which is kids fell a long way behind in the spring term, caught up a little bit, but not fully in the summer term. So again, and younger kids, once again, tended to fare worse, although, that's not universally true. So the year 5 and year 6 kids also didn't do too brilliantly. And once more, we've got, this is the pupil premium gap. Once more, the pupil premium gap in most year groups increased. This year 2, it didn't seem to increase, but most year groups, it seemed to have. We don't know. This could be a statistical effect, or it could be something else. But most year groups, the pupil premium gap did increase in maths. Just finally, we can also pick out different topics within maths as to which ones were more problematic. So you can see, for example, in the older year groups, geometry, which are the orange bars, seem to fare particularly badly, as just one example. So we're able to tease those out as well. Let me just, okay. So that's all I'm going to show you on that paper, I think. Hopefully you get a flavor for what's possible with these data sets. It's really important to understand that these are data sets that were gathered initially just in order to be able to serve individual schools. And what we're doing is aggregating at a national level and being able to tell this sort of national story of what's going on, particularly during the pandemic. And of course, this is particularly critical because the official tests have not been happening. So it's not just that they would be too slow because they only happen once a year and it takes many months to publish them. It's they're literally not happening at the moment. And so really this kind of analysis, the Education Policy Institute's been working with another company called Renaissance, doing similar types of analysis. So these types of analysis are really all that policymakers and indeed school leaders and teachers have to go on in order to help understand the nature of learning loss and how it might be mitigated. We've got some questions. Oh, so there's a question about what's driving this divide. Is it to do with access to devices? Yes, partly, and I'm going to come to that in just a moment. Have we compared the results of summative assessments or any forms of fun? So these are formative tests because those are the ones that are happening at the moment. So by summative, I assume you mean the statutory tests, right? The SATs. They'd be at primary school. So those are not happening at the moment. It's certainly the case that HODA have done analyses in the past to check that their tests are reliable predictors of performance in the SATs, if that makes sense, because that's sort of the basis on which they're sold. This helps the schools track and to set expectations for how their kids are going to do in the SATs ultimately, if that makes sense. Let me move on because I'm taking up too much time here. I apologize. So I'm going to talk about EdTech now. So there's a couple of things to talk about here. I'm going to post a couple of links here. These are, yeah, so this is the first example of EdTech usage. So both the examples I'm going to give you are work we did through Nesta. So Nesta, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, do quite a lot of work with EdTech companies, supporting them in various ways. We worked with them during the pandemic through Nesta with about a dozen in total EdTech companies to try and use the usage stats that were being gathered by these companies just in the normal course of their business and mostly sitting unanalyzed, I think it's fair to say, to try and understand what was going on. Let me give you an example. Some of the analysis is a bit involved, so I'm going to gloss over bits of it and we can come to it in the Q&A, or you can follow up afterwards if you want. But I'm just going to, I'm not going to dwell on this. I've included a link to this. This is actually a blog post that we wrote, but it's posted on the Nesta site. So we co-wrote it. I co-wrote it with Hannah Owen at Nesta, and includes our analysis. So I'll just show you a few examples of the sorts of things we looked at here. This initial analysis was looking particularly at maths learning products. Some of them were targeted at primary schools, some of them at secondary schools, some of them more at families and parents. This just looks at the increase in usage as the first lockdown kicked in. In fact, the increase in usage predated the lockdown, so people are anticipating it a bit. The products here are anonymous because we don't want to give any commercial confidences away. And they're all baseline, so that the pre-pandemic kind of mean is 100. And we can just see the relative uptick. So you see, they all increased in usage. Some of them even a little bit before the lockdown kicked in, which was sometime after 16th of March. I think, I can't remember the exact date right now. Took a dip during the Easter holiday, then came back again. This product 4, this red line here, was actually more aimed at parents and families. So it had more sort of steady growth during the early part of lockdown, but really started spiking later on, and didn't follow the sort of termly pattern. But you can see kind of across the board, all these different products of various kinds, all in maths, but various stages of maturity, various types of services offering, also big increases, which is what you might expect. I'm now going to just show you one bit of the analysis that hopefully will make sense. It's a little bit involved, but hopefully I'll be able to describe it to you in a way that makes sense. And we're just going to look at product 1, which is targeted at primary schools mostly. And we're going to look at two things, at teacher activity and at pupil activity. And these are two very, very important different measures to look at, right? And the purple bars here are showing what was the activity before lockdown, and in particular, what was the relative activity. So at schools with low deprivation rates, that means low proportions of kids on free school meals, and a medium, before lockdown, those schools are overrepresented. So it's all normalized so that allowing for pupil numbers and everything would come out 0. If all schools were using it equally, everything would come out at 0, right? And so we're just seeing that teacher activity is overrepresented before lockdown among the lower deprivation schools, the more affluent schools, and very much underrepresented in schools with lots of poor kids. During lockdown, that corrected somewhat. So what was happening was that schools with lots of poor kids tended not to be using this stuff pre-lockdown, and then they signed up in much greater than normal numbers as lockdown kicked in, and so they were using it much more actively. So there was, if you like, a redressing of the imbalance there, which seems like good news, but there is a sting in the tail here, which is if we look at pupil activity or student activity, the opposite is true. So what happened here was the high deprivation schools were underrepresented in terms of the pupil activity pre-pandemic, pre-lockdown. But after the lockdown kicked in, so this is basically data from the sort of, I don't know, the first half or the mid part of 2020, they were even more underrepresented, right? So what was happening was that schools were signing up and the teachers were signing up and starting to use it, but the kids just weren't engaging, possibly for reasons to do with access to technology, which is something I'll come into in just a second. So hopefully that made sense. It's a little bit of an abstract analysis, but hopefully that sort of made sense. So this is the kind of thing that we can track is, what's the sort of equity of usage, but not only usage by the school and the teachers, but the equity of engagement by the kids and how, how are they actually using it and are they engaging with the system? I'm going to leave this one and talk now about the second analysis we did with EdTech. I think we did do some analysis of device types here actually, but I'm going to leave that I think until I'm trying to think whether I should leave that. Yeah, I'll talk about the second analysis we did now. And hold on one second. Hopefully. And so this was an analysis we did with a slightly wider range of products. And again, it's posted on the Nesta website. And they posted it as a story in 4 graphs. And I'll try to summarize briefly what's happening. And this speaks to the device access issue that that there was a question about a little bit earlier. So I'm just going to try and remind myself what we did in this analysis now. Yeah, so this is just looking at relative usage. So again, these are a couple of different tools that we were looking at. This is actually one particular tool that we were looking at. Again, this is a maths learning product, I believe, if I remember the identity of it correctly. And we were looking at a bunch of different measures. And we can see that when the lockdown came in, the schools are closed, this is this red period here. There was a big uptick in usage. It sort of faded during the course of the term. When schools reopened, and term started again, there was also there was an uptick, but not nearly as big. And then when schools closed again in the new year, there was another uptick, but not as big as the first one, right? So we did see, so there's some indication that there's a little bit of kind of online fatigue, right? During the course of the term, usage slides, but also from one term to the next, even if schools are still closed, it wasn't being used as much. And importantly, that wasn't only seen for this product, it was seen for other products. Otherwise, it might just be a reflection that this product wasn't doing what schools needed. If we look at relative adoption levels by schools with high proportions of kids on free school meals, this is just showing if schools with high free school meals were using it in proportion, and in similar proportion to all the other schools in the system, we just see a straight line here at 0. And what we see actually is that they were underrepresented. This is another way of showing what I was showing you earlier. They're underrepresented, but then actually they sort of caught up, and if anything, they overtook a little bit as well. But it's very important. The proviso I presented earlier is very important, which you have to look at what kind of usage. Let me talk a little bit here about device access. So this is what the question was about. So here we're talking about, we're splitting schools into 3 groups: high deprivation, medium deprivation, low deprivation, based on the proportion of kids on free school meals. And we're saying over time, what proportion of sessions were used a computer, right? Use a computer as opposed to a mobile device. We can talk about tablet devices as well, but essentially the distinction here is between computers and mobile devices. And we see that early on during the pandemic, the red line, which is the high deprivation schools, had lower proportions of kids using computers, and the low deprivation schools had higher proportions of kids using computers. But that gap did close over the period of the pandemic. So particularly between the spring 2020 and spring 2021, that gap closed. And again, it wasn't only for this product. We have seen it with some other products as well. But crucially, once again, there's a bit of a sting in the tail. So this suggests that the effort by schools and government and others to get technology in the hands of more disadvantaged kids was having some effect. And the kids who were logging in, who were poorer and came from poorer schools, were more likely to be using computers once we were a year into the pandemic. But the thing we found was that just the engagement level, so this is now a measure of engagement, again, splitting schools into these 3 tiers of deprivation level. The engagement level, which basically talks about the level of pupil activity in comparison or in ratio to teacher activity at the same schools, was not as high, and the gap maintained. So what we're saying is that poorer kids who do log in are more likely to be using a computer now, but still fewer poor kids are logging in and actively engaging with the system. We have another analysis about to come out in the next few days using Oak National Academy data. I've just been working on that today. It should be out in the next few days, and it will speak to this as well. So we're able to use their data as well to look at very similar questions. But I would say, broadly speaking, the conclusions are somewhat similar, with some additional nuances and some new analyses that I can't speak about until after we publish it. I hope that makes sense. I am really thoroughly running out of time, so sorry, I've been going on too long. But I'm going to now there's two other analyses I want to talk about, so I'm going to give you the very brief versions of these. So this is the well-being survey from EduKit that I mentioned. So we've been working with them for a little while, certainly pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, during the initial stage of the pandemic, they set up a free well-being survey online, and we provided dashboards for that. So schools could come in and look at their own results as the results were coming in and benchmark them against the national picture. And this blog post here was looking at what had happened, when we gathered all the data over the course of basically last spring and summer, what was that telling us? I won't dwell too much on so let me just, I think what I'll dwell on is this, right? So one thing to say actually is that that overall life satisfaction scores are a bit higher for boys, a bit lower for girls. That's well established. We knew that before coronavirus came along. Girls dropped a little bit more during, sorry, no, that's not quite true. Sorry. Can't quite remember why we compared those 2 months, sorry. But boys tend to have a little bit higher scores than girls on average. Girls actually had a slightly better pandemic, so the gender gap actually shrunk a little bit, at least based on our analysis. But we were also able to ask them a whole bunch of questions about how they felt about things. So, for example, do they understand why they're not at school? Most kids of all different ages, these are the different year groups, did understand well why they weren't at school. What was the family involvement? Predictably, older kids, much less family involvement in their schoolwork. That's probably completely appropriate. But older kids were also a bit more worried about taking daily exercise or eating healthily. In particular, older kids were reporting really quite high levels of loneliness. So once you get out to the sixth form kids in years 12 and 13, half or even more of kids were reporting being lonely, at least a bit, or very often. So these really correlates very strongly with age, and some quite, I think, somewhat worrying stats on their opinions on the provision of wellbeing and mental health support by their schools. That certainly didn't come out well for teenagers. And just for reasons of speed, I'll just tell you briefly what we're also able to do is to correlate answers to those questions with overall well-being, right? And so we're able to try and infer what are the drivers for what really, makes what seems to drive overall self-reported well-being in terms of, whether they're comfortable at home, whether they're lonely, blah, 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 all of those sorts of things. And we find that across all different year groups and all pupils, we find that feelings of loneliness rated very highly. Also, their comfort in doing schoolwork at home. But it varied quite a bit by primary school pupils tended to prioritize more issues around feeling comfortable at home. Secondary school kids tended to prioritize more feeling lonely, or the inverse of that. There wasn't too much difference between boys and girls in this particular study. So in this blog post, we talk in a bit more detail about the sort of the whys and wherefores of all of these different correlations. My big takeaway was that among older kids in particular, so secondary and particularly older secondary school kids, loneliness was a big problem and was a big driver of overall self-reported well-being. So that's that. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. I don't think there are any more questions. So I'll show you the final analysis. So again, I just mentioned that these wellbeing surveys, again, these are conducted by EduKit for individual schools. That's their business to do that. And what we're doing here is doing like an anonymous analysis at the national level in order to be able to pick out these broader trends, right? So this is data that's been gathered anyway, but hadn't until this point been analysed at a national level. So finally, let me show you.
Timo, we've got one question has come in here from Lance.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. So it's a really good point, and I glossed over it. These are all calibrated or normalized so that positive responses correlate with positive well-being, if that makes sense. So in other words, feeling lonely means positively correlates with. So not feeling lonely positively correlates with overall well-being. Sorry for not explaining that. So we normalize it in such a way that they're all pointing in the same direction, and we don't have to. There's no negative correlations, if that makes sense. Sorry for not making that clear. The final one I'll show you is about school recruitment. So the source of this data is school websites. So for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been indexing the websites of all the secondary schools, sixth form colleges and FE colleges in England. And we've been gathering data about vacancies, but specifically for teachers and technicians. And we've been doing that in collaboration with the Gatsby Foundation. We're very interested in the whole teacher recruitment market, particularly around science teachers and technology teachers, but more generally as well. We've been working with them on this for many years now, actually. But again, it became particularly relevant during the pandemic. And we just put out our latest analysis last week, which is also in collaboration with TeacherTapp, that many of you will know as a teacher survey company. And we've been working with them on a couple of analyses now, where we're able to provide the stats about what's happening in the market, what's the number of vacancies, what's the level of teacher recruitment and technician recruitment, and how does that relate to survey responses from teachers and school leaders around what their experiences and expectations are. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the TeacherTapp results. They are in the paper, but since I wasn't directly responsible for those, I feel like I should leave it up to Laura and Becky and the people at TeacherTapp to explain those, but they are fabulous. So they really add to the story massively. So I encourage you to look at them. I'm going to talk mostly about what we're doing with the data that we can gather from school websites. And I'll just take you through this quickly. So here's a chart on the blog post I've sent you the link to. And this is the last pre-pandemic year. You can see that this is just looking at the number of teacher vacancy ads appearing on school websites, basically week by week through the academic year from September through to the end of August. And this is 2018, 2019. So this is the last pre-pandemic year. And it follows a very predictable seasonal cycle. So there's this peak in sort of April, May time. And you've got these dips during the holidays and during half term and so forth. It's really very predictable. And then along comes 2019, 2020. It tracked very closely until, surprise, surprise, mid-March, where it was much, much lower than the previous year. It continued much lower. And then in 2020, 21, it continued lower again. By the time we got to March, it was a bit up on the previous year when the first lockdown had come in, but not really that much. It was certainly well below normal year. And so far this year, in the current academic year, the first month of it in September, it's tracking much closer to last year than it is to pre-pandemic years, even though schools have opened up, right? And actually, this is easier to see if you look at it cumulatively. So this is the week by week figures, but if we look at it cumulatively, you can see that much more clearly, right? So this green line is the normal year of how ads appear over, or vacant positions appear over the course of the year. This was the first pandemic year that was tracking with that until March, but then dipped and came out well below. So came out, I don't know, about 5,000 ads lower than one might expect, a bit less than that, 4,500 ads lower than one might expect. The academic year just completed has been even worse, partly because we've had a whole year of pandemic as opposed to just part of the year of pandemic, but it's actually in aggregate been even worse, as in even lower activity overall, even lower teacher turnover, even lower teacher hiring. And this year so far, which is this little purple line down here, is tracking pretty much along the lines of last year. So even though schools have opened up, the teacher recruitment market hasn't. And that has all sorts of implications. For some schools, it's good. For schools that typically have vacancies and find it hard to recruit, which usually means struggling schools, high deprivation levels, those kinds of things, it's probably a good news because there's basically less teacher turnover. If you're a newly qualified teacher or you're a teacher that wants to or needs to shift job, it makes life very difficult. So it does create all sorts of problems in the market. Another way of showing this is just looking at the different, this is a chart that's looking at the difference compared to the last pre-pandemic year. And again, I'll show you the cumulative data. So this is showing the difference in the 2019-2020 year compared to the year earlier, which was pre-pandemic. And actually, leading up to mid-March, things have been booming, actually. It had been a stronger than usual market, if that makes sense. And then it sort of went off a cliff. And then this shows you the big gap that's opened up during the last academic year and the fact that the current academic year is tracking that. It's also the case that it does vary by subject. You can explore subjects on this chart, but it's probably easier to see here. This shows you the different subjects and the different percentage year-on-year changes. So in the last academic year, as actually in the previous one, the big subjects, so English, maths and science, were particularly big, affected a lot. And that's not only in absolute terms of number of advertisements, which one might expect, but also in percentage terms. So they've really taken a big hit in terms of the amount of vacancies in those big subjects. Let me just, one other thing that's interesting to note, this is not specifically to do with the pandemic, but I'll just mention it because I think it is a super interesting thing that we've been looking at for some time, is when you look at science teachers and you look at the proportions of science teacher vacancies that are for particular specializations, so biology, chemistry, physics, whatever, versus just a generalist science teacher, you see some very clear trends. So we've got different colored bars here for the different academic years, but actually the trends are pretty much the same. So this hasn't been affected by the pandemic very much. So if you look at basically deprivation level, you'll find that schools with lower deprivation, more affluent schools, or schools in more affluent areas, much more likely to be recruiting for specialist science teachers. Same sort of thing for Ofsted rating, as I recall. So low Ofsted rating means much less likely to be recruiting for specialist science teachers. So those of us who care, I used to be a scientist, those of us who care about science education find this very troubling. You can find all sorts of other trends. I mean, completely unsurprisingly, grammar schools are also much more likely to recruit for specialist science teachers. Schools with sixth forms are much more likely to recruit for specialist science teachers. But this is a pre-pandemic effect that's persisted during the pandemic, but a very important one that I think we shouldn't lose sight of. And just finally on this, I'll just mention technicians. So I mentioned we track technician recruiting. Technicians much smaller in number than teachers, and they're limited to specific subjects. So they're typically around arts, technology, science. That's a completely different market, right? So if we look at what's happening there cumulatively, we just show you, this is similar to the first graph we looked at. So the green line is showing the last pre-pandemic year. This is the normal kind of accumulation of technician vacancies. Then we had the pandemic year, where from March onwards, it was a much slower market and opened up a gap by the end of the academic year. The last academic year just gone was much slower to begin with, but actually caught up and actually ended up pretty much the same number of vacancies as a normal year. And the year so far, this academic year is booming for technicians. So this is much more reflective of the broader economy, right? So there seems to be a lot of turnover now in positions in the broader economy. Teachers are an exception; they're not the rule, and they're the exception within schools, it's not just that schools are an exception to the broader economy. Teachers are an exception. We've got lower turnover, much lower turnover of teachers, but we've actually got much higher turnover of technicians and much more activity in that area. You can see the same thing here for technicians. This is the net change year on year. So this first pandemic year kind of went off a cliff. The year just gone, it was very slow to begin with, but caught up. And this year is absolutely booming. It's completely unprecedented in terms of the amount of technician recruiting activity, presumably because technicians, they mix with other sectors of the economy, right? In a way that teachers less often do. And so this is much more reflective of what's going on elsewhere in the economy. There's lots more analysis on there, but I'm going to stop there because I've gone on too long already, and I do want to leave proper. There are some questions. Let me have a look. Do teachers actually engage with the results of your analysis? Yeah, to some degree. I'm sure there are lots of teachers who don't. Most teachers, I'm sure, do not. We do work with some schools. We've done quite a lot of work with Academies Enterprise Trust, a big multi-academy trust. We also interact with teachers quite a bit. We get sent queries and requests and ideas from teachers. We do a fair amount of pro bono work for schools, probably too much, more than we should from a strictly commercial point of view. But we don't have a lot of evidence. I guess I'm an evidence guy, and I can't present evidence that teachers engage with this. I can only provide anecdotal feedback. We'd love them to engage more. I suppose the main way that we invite them to engage is by we do work closely with the industry, with the mainstream and industry media. So we work with schools where you can test, and the Guardian and the Economist and BBC, and to get the results out there so that people can are aware of the analysis we've done. But beyond that, we haven't done an impact analysis of our own work, I'm afraid. Perhaps that's something we should do, very meta. Question is, how highly does teacher satisfaction correlate with student satisfaction? I don't know. It's a great question. So we don't measure teacher satisfaction. So the well-being surveys that we've run with Educate have just been focused on pupils, not on teachers. I know Edurio and others do teacher well-being surveys as well, so Yanis may want to speak to that. The one thing I will say is there's a really strong correlation, that we have blog posts about this as well. There's a really strong correlation between indicators that a school is quote unquote struggling, so low Ofsted rating, low attainment and progress levels, high levels of deprivation, those kinds of things, which are classic indicators that a school might be struggling. There's a very strong correlation between all those kinds of indicators and amount of sickness leave. So sickness leave among staff. So lowly rated Ofsted schools have, I can't remember, like double the sickness leave rates of schools with high Ofsted ratings, right? So that might, I surmise that that's an indicator not just of the intrinsic kind of health of the teachers and the staff at the school, but possibly their, just how they feel about their jobs, right? So let's see. Okay, thank you for the comments. Is it more difficult to establish correlation causation with unconventional? I think it's always difficult to establish causation versus correlation, and I think one needs to be. I was talking with Yanis about this recently when we met. One needs to be suitably Bayesian about it. I think one needs to take all sorts of different factors into account and try and decide how plausible it is that a correlation actually is causation. I don't think there's a definitive way of establishing that. I just think like philosophically there isn't. So you need to kind of basically try and understand like how plausible is it. And of course, ultimately what you want to be able to do is do like randomized controlled trials or other kind of gold standard type analyses, which I definitely consider to be, what I'm describing here is complementary to those kinds of things. Sometimes you can make use of really nice natural experiments. We've done that kind of thing, looking at like comparing local authorities that do and don't have grammar schools, for example, right? And you can't control perfectly, but you can do some quite good controls on that. But ultimately, if something's really important, you want to do randomized controlled trials. And even that doesn't definitively tell you that it's definitely a causation. I mean, there's Simpson's paradox and all sorts of other things that can kick in. But I think that helps a lot. So I would consider this to be complementary to those kinds of things and helping to inform them. And I'm going to, in the closing slides, I'll actually come back to that point. Thanks for the comment. So is it possible that students' cooperation with the teacher and vice versa will reflect an interaction between the two parties, make the restrictions set by the pandemic conditions very flexible? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and one that I need to reflect on more. I think we've barely begun to understand what all of this means. So I presented you with some like, oh, look, we've got these effects, this has gone up, this has gone down, these things seem to co-correlate. I think we've just barely begun to scratch the surface about what that all might mean and what, why these things are happening and what we ought to do about them. So I'm gonna gloss over that and say I don't know. I mean, these are all really good questions, but we're just, this is the first step in the journey to understanding the answer to those questions. I don't have the answers for you just yet. Let me, Yanis has a hand up. Yanis, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, a question sort of from a very practical point of view. How much of your work is typically sort of hypothesis driven versus exploratory? Because the data set is weird. You can find lots of things there, and how much of the work you're doing ends up on the cutting room floor, sort of seen by nobody in no blog ever?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, or you could put it another way: how much are we p hacking? It's a great question. There's certainly more analysis we do than we publish, and we have certain kind of routine ways of slicing and dicing the data. For example, by school type. So whenever we look at something, we have a piece of code that we can run the results through that slices and dice it by size of school or by deprivation level or by kind of faith status or region or whatever. And we'll often look through that and say, like, are there any interesting trends here? It's definitely possible that some of that is spurious. So we're always trying to look, for example, when we analyze multiple EdTech product usage data, we try and look for similar patterns in multiple products, right? That would be an example, because just finding a pattern in one product over one period of time is not particularly convincing in my view. On the other hand, I think this comes back to what you and I were discussing the other week, Yanis, right, about being a good Bayesian. If you've already got good existing reasons to think that there might be an effect, or there's other existing data, then this can help reinforce that, or help, you know, clarify it or quantify it or whatever. I think it's always a risk. We do try and do things like, you know, analyze subsets of data, and we do publish negative results as well. So typically our interactive figures, when we slice and dice by different school type, we'll typically show all the different school types. We'll draw attention to certain trends in the text, but we'll invite you to go and have a look at the other trends or non-existent trends as well. So yeah, I'm not sure that's an adequate answer, because I'm not sure there is an adequate answer. We're all trying to feel our way with this stuff. And I think the short answer is to be a good Bayesian, but I'm not sure that's an adequate answer.
Okay. Can I chip in there? Just as another Bayesian, we need some frequentists here, or somebody else representing a different viewpoint. But I thought these analyses were really, really very, very interesting. But I had pretty much the same question as Yanis, which was basically, do you ever look at modeling or coming up with models for the data, and then testing those models and looking, for example, at prediction as well as the data exploration that we've seen. And I think you pretty much answered that, but what I wondered about doing is you have this wealth of domain experts out there in the teachers. Do you ever work with the teachers to kind of ask them, you know, what do you think is happening here? What do you think is happening? Can we codify that as a model, and then combine that with the data to see if we can do some interesting predictions?
For sure, yeah, and it's worth saying, you know, so we work with our collaborators who are educationalists of various stripes. So our analysis is not completely hypothesis free. I should say that up front. Like, normally we're going into a piece of analysis trying to see, is this or isn't the case? Is this or isn't this the case? Right. So things like use of technology and edtech products. Right. This was a hypothesis going in, and it was somewhat confirmed by the results. Right. So our collaborators act as a check, and usually they and we are coming in with certain hypotheses we're trying to test. We also have friendly experts who will share early versions of our analysis with to try and understand what's going on, or that they can help us sort of ground it in the real world. And then we also do things like the example with the recruitment data, where we're working with Teacher Chat, where we're able to combine the survey data from teachers and school leaders with the market data, as it were, and that helps us draw more meaningful conclusions. So, for example, in the early stages of the pandemic, when teacher recruitment ads sort of fell off a cliff, the question was, is that because schools have vacancies that they can't fill because they're closed and they don't know how to recruit under lockdown? Or is it that teachers are just not resigning, you know, and therefore they don't have vacancies to fill? And it turns out it's a little bit of both, and the proportions have changed during the course of the pandemic, as you might expect. So it was a little bit, at the beginning, it was more like they don't know how to recruit because they're closed. And later on, it was a reduction in overall turnover, and so they didn't have vacancies to fill in the first place. So there are questions like that we can test using other sources of information, like surveys, for example. Again, I mean, this is like, you could probably run a whole series of talks on that, just that question, I dare say, because it's a big one. Let me just wrap up here, and then if there are, let me see. So I'm just going to skip through. These are the slides you'll have access to afterwards. They've got various screenshots and URLs to things we talked about. So this kind of, my definition of unconventional data, hopefully I've made clear, is usually it's data that exists out there already but are not being analysed in this way. They're plentiful. There's no extra burden on the schools or the teachers, and you can often analyse them in something approaching real time. Certainly, we were able to look at the primary attainment data within days, really, of the data being made available to us. Which turned out to be important in that case. But they are diverse and inconsistent. The samples can be skewed. You know, they're not under our experimental control. So we have to bear that in mind when analysing them. So I think they're complementary to more formal approaches and to more established data sets. But I do think they're incredibly useful and insightful, so we should be making use of them. There's lots of precedents in other domains. You know, I come out of the scientific domain, where, you know, increasingly one's making use of observational data. We're gathering large quantities of data and doing, in some cases, rather hypothesis-free types of analyses, actually. You know, in other cases, just using large quantities of data in order to pull out signal from the noise, and that goes everything from particle physics and cosmology to biology and medicine, but also increasingly in economics and public policy. You know, there was this meme went around a few months ago with Andy Haldane, who was then the chief economist at the Bank of England, using this, what was described as quirky, untested daily data to try and work out what was happening in the economy without relying so much on the official stats from places like the ONS. And Tarian Diamond, the national statistician, wrote this blog post on the ONS blog, actually saying that basically public stats have changed forever as a result of the pandemic. And in fact, this week's, the current issue of The Economist has a special on this exact topic, right, which is that we've got this new phase of economics, which has sort of moved on from Adam Smith, who we have here, who sort of established modern economic theory, and the highly analytical approach that's exemplified here by the Scholes-Black options pricing equation, now to a much more observational approach, right, that is not necessarily completely hypothesis free, it can be, but is dealing with much larger quantities of very messy data. And this is a general trend now in the social sciences. I mean, I started off by showing you some social media data. At some level, because society is digitized and connected now, we don't have to go out with a clipboard and interview 100 people and extrapolate. We can sort of measure everything in real time, with all the caveats that come with that. And so I think this is a really important area for education as well. And one of the things that we're trying to do now is to establish a means for doing the kind of analysis I've been showing you, but on an ongoing basis. And in some ways, this helps to alleviate some of the problems we've just been discussing, because if we take constant feeds of data and are analyzing them more or less in real time and making the results available, whether they show a signal or a difference or not, these, you know, we can identify things that we might want to track, like what kinds of technology are kids using to access online resources, for example. What are the differences in engagement level between poorer schools or areas and more affluent ones, those kinds of things. Those are the sorts of things, it seems to me, that we want to monitor on an ongoing basis, because we want to know how bad the problems are, we want to know whether they're getting better or worse, and we want to know whether our efforts to mitigate them are having any impact. And these are exactly the sorts of things that we can measure in real time. So one of the things that we're doing now is working with some of these data providers and collaborators to set up an ongoing process to be able to do this in more or less real time, and wrapping that probably within a data trust. That's something we're exploring at the moment in order to make sure that the proper use is made of the data. In other words, the data won't be owned by School Dash or any individual entity. It'll be governed by a trust with a board of trustees that make sure we're only using it to the benefit of the subjects of that data in the broader education system, and that we won't go down the path of a Google or a Facebook, if you like. That's a very, very quick description of where we're coming from. I'm going to stop there and invite any further questions. Here's some contact information if you want to follow up any further. I'm available at timo@schooldash.com. And with that, I will draw breath and I will have a look at the questions and try and answer any, but do chime in with any more, either in the chat or verbally.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Timo. I'm going to look out for any questions here. Do interrupt me if you have any questions of your own. The most important question is, if somebody here, an individual, wants to just have a look at School Dash, get started, maybe investigate one of the analyses, is the best bet to go to one of the blog posts, or should they sign up for School Dash? What's the best place?
Yeah, have a look at, I mean, if any of the analyses I've presented are interesting, have a look at the links I've posted, which are mostly to our blog. We do, I mean, the stuff on our website is almost all of it's freely available. There's one paid for section called Insights, which is a kind of constantly updated dashboard of actually mostly conventional data sets. It's really a sort of superset of analyses that we've been asked to do repeatedly for various people. So we just decided to wrap it up into a subscriber dashboard, and our clients subscribe to that instead of getting us to redo it every time they want updated numbers. But if you want access to that, there's information about it on schooldash.com. If you want access to it, you can sign up for a free trial, or send me an email and I'll get you set up with a free trial if you want to be able to see that. Everything else is freely available on the site. We do, obviously, quite a lot of the work we do is not published because it's commissioned by clients who want to use it in their own way. But we do try really hard to publish everything we can. So for example, I mentioned this earlier, but we've done a big analysis with Oak National Academy that I think had some really interesting results in terms of their usage patterns that tell us things, not just about Oak, but about the state of education in England. And they published some of that in their annual report. They've used some of it internally, but they've very kindly given us permission to publish a blog post that we're coming out in the next few days so that we can share the results with the wider world. So we do try very hard to, so keep an eye on the blog is the main thing. We don't unfortunately have a mailing list, but if you email me, then for now, I will ping you when we have something significant. That's the non-scalable solution we have at the moment. We must fix that sometime soon.
That's that really is a non-scalable solution, Timo. You must sort that out. There's got to be a lot of people who would find this really, really valuable insights.
We do also tweet. So I'm not a big fan of Twitter. I'm not averse to analysing their data, as I can say. I'm not a big fan of Twitter myself, but we do tweet at School Dash, and we tweet links to things we find interesting. But we also tweet links to new analyses we put out, which we normally publish something once or twice a month on average, right? It varies, but this is going to be a bumper month. But it waxes and wanes. But if you keep an eye on our Twitter feed, then you can also find it there.
I had a question, just because I love plots. I love a good plot, and that was just full of wonderful plots. How do you decide on your plots? Are you the chief plot engineer for School Dash, or?
Yeah, I mean, I really do all the technical work. So I have someone who does. We have someone who does our media and comms. I have someone who does business development for us. I have someone who does all the legal and financial stuff. At the moment, all the technical work is me. So you are looking at School Dash. How do we decide on it? What we think is interesting. We hope that what we find interesting, other people will find interesting. And a lot of D3. But basically,
yep. So D3 is a library. A library for plotting, so JavaScript library for plotting, but exactly. For those. Would you recommend anybody getting into this, if there's anybody in the audience today, if they're kind of budding data scientists or early in their career, what's the best way for them to kind of get involved? Is it you mentioned there's a free subscription, is there, to the data trust, or there's going to be a free? Is that like an individual license?
So I suppose there's two things. So, well, maybe there's three things. So one is just generally in how to get involved in this stuff. I can't recommend a better approach than the way I got involved, which is someone randomly asked me to run some data for schools when I was doing something completely unrelated about 8 years ago, and I just found it so fascinating I couldn't let it go. So I ended up building he asked me for a half a dozen PowerPoint slides, and I ended up building a database covering all the schools in the country. Long story, that's a whole nother lecture, but just get stuck in with the data. I think in terms of getting involved with School Dash generally, have a look at our blog. If any of it captures your interest, write to me. There's a general contact email address on basically every page on the site as well, so you can write to that if you don't want to write to me personally, or you forget my email address or something. But have a look at our blog posts, and we really genuinely welcome feedback. Particularly critical feedback that means we can be better next time. So if there's anything that we could be doing better, then let us know. If you want to know how we did anything, we're more than happy to share insights, code, all of that stuff. We try and be very open about this stuff. The data trust stuff that you alluded to, that I just mentioned very speedily at the end, this is really, for me, is the sort of culmination of, we've been through this pandemic, we've done a whole load of one-off analyses that have proved, we think, very insightful, and they seem to have been interest to the education system and the policymakers. My view is that should be part of the new normal now. We shouldn't just be using this data during pandemic and unusual times like this. We should be using it always, right? With all the appropriate caveats. But this is a rich source of insight that we should be making use of on an ongoing basis. If anyone here has data we might use in that context, is interested just in the idea, just wants to find out more, wants to help out in some way or be involved, just contact me. This is a work in progress. I don't know exactly what's going to happen or when. We're trying with this is sort of real time stuff. So contact me, and it'll be great to talk about it some more.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. One awkward question for the end. Have you used my publicly available data set for your work yet?
I don't think I have. No, I should.
We could talk.
There's a to do for me, which is to follow up with you to find out more about that.
Yeah, no, we must.
one of the downsides of being kind of having too much to do is I just get completely immersed in what I'm doing at any given moment and don't do a scan of the horizon enough as to what else we should be doing. So let's follow up on that, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm suitably embarrassed and put in my place now.
No, not at all. Not at all. But yes, and I would like to learn more about the data trust. This is a real issue that I think probably most of us here are aware of. We probably have some teachers here and some data science amongst the data scientists. There is understandably a lot of sensitivity around data, and I absolutely love the idea that you've set up this data trust to try and address that. I think that's a fantastic idea. There's lots and lots of thanks in the chat window. I can add to that. That was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much. We will let people go, but I will share the link to the slides and a video recording of the talk as well. So if you like this, look out for the next meetings, and also let people know about the recording so they can catch up on this as well. So thank you very much, Timo.